Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of Revisiting Madmen. In today's episode we're going to be analysing Red in the Face, and this episode was written by Bridget Bedard and it was directed by Tim Hunter. The opening scene of this episode shows Don talking to Betty's therapist on the phone. The therapist says a few things that are very important for this episode. We'll go through them one by one. The first thing I want to talk about is the therapist's reasoning as to why he thinks Betty's so depressed, and he says, the death of a parent is extremely destabilizing. I think this is describing Don. I think a major reason for Don's depression is the fact that his mum died in childbirth, and his dad, I think he watched his dad die, get kicked by a horse in the face, which he tells Peggy in The Suitcase, season 4, episode 7. So I think the writers here are just describing Don's personality and why Don is as depressed as he is. The therapist then goes on to recommend time and talk for Betty to help her in a situation, which is again what I think helps Don out of his situation in the final moments of the series in person to person. I think the time part of that statement is, well, it's evident that Don's been depressed for a long time by that point at the end of season 7. And the talk portion of that sentence is, well, I think they show Don talking a lot in the final episode, in the phone calls, for example, when he's having really honest conversations with Peggy, with Betty, revealing some parts about his personality that he's never told Peggy before, for example. And then finally with the monologue that Leonard gives, and that finally seems like it really strikes a chord with Don, who obviously embraces Leonard. And then after that we see Don, very happy on a cliff, smiling and wearing a beautiful crisp white shirt. Now, I don't know, I'm pretty sure Matthew Weiner wasn't thinking about that in this very script, I doubt he was. But it certainly is what pans out in the show. Time and talk is what ultimately seems to save Don in some way. Although I know some people don't even agree that he's quote unquote saved by the end. I think Jon Hamm himself actually says in one interview that he thinks Don dies a few years after we see the coke ad, and that he died miserably as well. I don't know, I would take that with a pinch of salt. Even Jon Hamm himself says that he's just making that up, as would Matt Weiner, of course, and as we are when I create my own idea of how it ends, which is that Don lives happily ever after. But that's just how I choose to think about it. And Jon Hamm is making a point there. He's saying you can decide what happens after the show ends. Just make it up. And in his opinion, Don dies miserably, which is fair enough. But my view is that he lives happily ever after. And that what this therapist is saying, that time and talk helps, I think that's what Don eventually seeks at the Esalen retreat. Whether it's conscious or subconscious, he ends up there and he finds peace, I think. Moving on, the therapist says that Betty has the emotions of a child. Once again, this is describing Don. In this episode, we see Don and Roger having a bit of a feud, which all begins because Roger, in Don's view, was inappropriate with Betty. And this shows Don acting very immaturely when he gets, as the therapist said. So the therapist also described Betty as being overly concerned with petty jealousies. And that's again what Don is doing when he's, confronts Betty about how Roger was flirting with her and how she was flirting with him. And that to me is immature behavior. As Betty says, it's your boss, I was just being friendly. And to ramp it up even more, when he comes home later on in the episode from work one day, I think it's the next day actually, Betty cooks roast beef and he walks into the door and she's really cheerful and tells him that she cooked roast beef and she's cutting the string. And he walks in and he says, roast beef, it's just me tonight. And in that scene, the child is Don. It's clearly Don being an absolute brat, basically. And he's the one being jealous. So although Betty's therapist accuses her of being jealous, which maybe she can be, it's Don too. And on the topic of Don's immaturity, let's talk about the main story in this episode, which is concerning Roger and Don's feud, which I referred to earlier. Just so we're all on the same page, the basic story is, I'm just gonna whiz through the beginning of it. Don invites Roger over for dinner. Roger is inappropriate with Betty. He doesn't actually make a move because Betty basically doesn't let him. But he is inappropriate and he does say some inappropriate things. Although Don isn't in the room when this happens, he immediately senses it when he gets back. Interestingly, Roger visits Don's office the next day with an olive branch of sorts. He offers him a bottle of alcohol, and he apologizes for his behavior. And Don seemingly accepts his apology. He makes a joke about returning the alcohol glass that Roger took from their house the night before, and that's that. It seems like all is done. But as I said, Don is immature. And he, like a boy, like a child, has to win this, I think, in his mind. And so I'm going to skip some stuff out. I'm skipping out, it's a very funny storyline, but there isn't much to analyze. So I'm just going to skip through all the stuff with Pete receiving 2 chip and dips for his wedding gifts, and he returns the chip and dip for a gun. But there's nothing to analyze, so I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to skip to Don speaking to Hollis, who runs the elevator in the building where Sterling Cooper is located. And they don't show us the conversation between Don and Hollis. All they show us is Don approaching Hollis and pulling out his wallet, and we can fill in the blanks here when we see what happens later on in the episode. So the next we see of Don and Roger is them eating oysters. And they eat in a lot of them. And Don is really intelligent here. Roger asks him, are you ready for another? As in, are you ready for another platter of oysters, I'm assuming? And then Don says, you're leading this dance. And this makes Roger feel like he's in control, basically. And that eating that many oysters was his idea, when really it was Don's all along. Don and Roger enter the Sterling Cooper building. Hollis tells them that the lift is out of service, and this forces them to use the stairs. And as they walk away, we see Don wave his hat at Hollis as if to say thank you. And then we're shown these scenes of Don and Roger really struggling to go up the stairs, but Roger struggling way more. And Don sort of rubs it in here, even asking at one point, do you want me to run ahead and get started in the meeting without you? Which I think to someone like Roger, who's a very traditional man, it's extremely emasculating for him, because he wants to appear like he's strong and fit and like he can hold his liquor, but it's not true. Don is obviously, being younger, just stronger and fitter, and I don't think Roger realizes it yet that this was all Don's, this is all Don's doing, and this is his plan. Eventually they get to the top, and the people who they're having the meeting with, people from Nixon's team. Bert Cooper is introducing them to Roger, and Roger throws up all over the place, and that is the end of the episode. It's extremely embarrassing. And as the men walk away, that's Pete, Bert and the Nixon boys, Don lingers behind and asks Roger, are you okay? And we see Roger look up at Don and say, I'm fine. And I think this shot is showing us the moment Roger realizes that Don was in charge the whole time and was actually planning to do that to Roger from the beginning. And I think when we see Don walking away and smiling at the camera, that's when the audience are made sure that yes, this was Don's plan all along. And now that he's won, he's content, I think. And that's where the episode ends, on Don's face, walking away and smiling. And that's all I have to say for this week's episode. It was a nice and light one. There isn't too much deep stuff going on. However, the same can't be said for next week's episode, which is called The Hobo Code. And let's just say it's not funny. It's more on the dark side. We delve into a little bit about Dick Whitman and his childhood. And I'm looking forward to it because it is one of my favorite episodes. Thank you very much for listening, folks. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
It's a chip and dip. It's a chip and dip. It's a chip and dip. It's a chip and dip.
That was a wedding gift from my Aunt Letty. And you go and get some stupid toy? I can't believe you. That was for us. You're always telling me to grow up. I can't believe you.
It's a chip and dip. It's a chip and